Picture this. It is a Saturday morning, July 5th, 2026. You decide to take a walk along the beach at Forest Beach in Queensland, Australia. The sand is wet, the morning light is catching the surface of the water, and everything feels ordinary and quiet in the way that Australian beaches often do. And then you see it, a large metallic sphere sitting in the sand, shiny, heavy, roughly twice the size of a basketball. And then you see another one, and another, 6 of them in total, scattered along the shoreline like something fell out of the sky and left them there. What would you do? Walk over and examine it? Take out your phone and start filming? Call somebody? Feel free to let me know in the comments, because that question turns out to be more important than it sounds. Because what those 6 metal spheres sitting on an Australian beach actually are, and what they tell us about something happening above your head right now, at this exact moment, that most people have absolutely no idea about, is the real story here. And it is one of the most consequential issues that the space industry, every government that launches rockets, and frankly, every person living under a sky that now contains more hardware than at any other point in human history, is going to have to confront head-on in the years immediately ahead. Welcome to John's Global Guide, where we go past the headline and into what is actually happening. Let's start with exactly what unfolded at Forest Beach, because the sequence of events is worth understanding in detail. On July 5th, 2026, residents of the coastal town reported the discovery of 6 large unidentified metallic spheres that had washed up on the beach. Images of the recovered objects at Forest Beach in Queensland, Australia, were captured and shared by the Australian Space Agency. The immediate response from local authorities was not casual curiosity. It was the kind of response you deploy when you do not yet know what you're dealing with. Queensland emergency responders arrived and established exclusion zones around the objects. The large objects are roughly twice the size of a basketball, local residents reported. Hazmat-suited teams moved carefully across the sand, treating the unknown objects with the kind of respect you extend to something when you genuinely do not know what is inside it, and for good reason. Never touch, move, or recover suspected space debris and assume it to be hazardous until advised otherwise. Move away and contact emergency services, wrote an Australian Space Agency spokesperson in an email to CNN. Then, within days, the Australian Space Agency made an announcement that moved the story from local curiosity to something much larger in its implications. The recovered objects appear to be pressure vessels from a space launch vehicle, the Space Agency wrote. The object's location and characteristics are consistent with debris from a foreign rocket body that recently re-entered the atmosphere from orbit. Pressure vessels, sturdy tanks in which gases or liquids were stored under high pressure during a rocket launch or during operation in orbit. Hardware that was built to survive the violent conditions of spaceflight, which is precisely why it also survived the fiery journey back down through the atmosphere. Australian National University astrophysicist Brad Tucker said the number of objects found suggests they may have come from something large. So the fact that there's reportedly 3 tanks means it's either a very large satellite or indeed the upper stage of a rocket, Tucker told 7 News. And here is the detail that turns a beach discovery story into a genuinely important moment. As of this week, the Australian Space Agency is currently working with international authorities to determine which vehicle the Spaceballs fell from and which nation conducted a launch. They do not yet know whose rocket produced this debris. They do not know which launch. They do not know which country is responsible for the hardware that landed on an Australian beach last weekend. In a world where there are now more rockets launching per year than at any previous point in human history, that uncertainty, that inability to immediately trace 6 large metallic objects back to a specific vehicle and a specific launch, is itself one of the most telling aspects of the entire story. Now, before anyone gets to the alien theory, and it will come up, it always does with metallic spheres, let's be completely clear about what is and is not going on here. These are not extraterrestrial objects. They are not unexplained in the scientific sense. They are human-made hardware from a human-made rocket that was launched into orbit and eventually fell back to Earth. The origin is entirely earthly, even if the journey it took before landing on that Australian beach was not. The reason they look unusual, the reason they catch your eye sitting in the sand rather than blending into the background, is precisely because they were engineered to withstand conditions that nothing on the surface of the Earth naturally experiences. Extreme temperature cycling, vacuum, radiation, the mechanical stress of launch and orbital insertion. These objects were built to be tough, and toughness is exactly what allowed them to survive re-entry through an atmosphere that burns away the vast majority of everything that tries to fall through it. But the spheres at Forest Beach are not the only incident that has happened, not even close. Similar notable incidents over recent years include December 2024 in Kenya, where a heavy metal separation ring crashed into a rural village, July 2022 in Australia, where charred debris from a SpaceX Crew Dragon spacecraft crashed into the snowy mountains of New South Wales, and July 2022 in Southeast Asia, where discarded pieces from the core stage of a Chinese rocket fell across parts of Malaysia and Indonesia, Kenya, Australia, Malaysia, Indonesia, and now Queensland again. 4 different countries, 4 different incidents across a span of less than 4 years. All of them representing moments when hardware that was launched into space came back down and landed somewhere unexpected on the surface of a planet where people live. In 2023, a mysterious 10-foot cylinder washed ashore at Greenhead, a coastal town north of Perth, Australia. And in 2024, debris from the International Space Station that had been expected to burn up as it fell to Earth struck a Florida home. A Florida home, not a remote desert, not an uninhabited ocean floor, a residential property. Hardware from a structure orbiting more than 400 kilometers above the Earth's surface fell through the atmosphere and hit a house. The ISS debris event in 2024 made international headlines, partly because the specific piece involved was one that NASA had calculated would burn up completely during re-entry, and then it didn't. The gap between prediction and reality in that case is exactly the kind of gap that space debris specialists have been warning about for years. We've had more space launches in the last 5 years than in the whole of history, said space archaeologist Alice Gorman. That means there are more re-entries happening, more launches than in the whole of history. Let that settle for a moment. The space industry has gone through a transformation in the last decade that has no precedent. The rise of commercial launch providers, the explosion of satellite constellation programs, the involvement of new national space programs from countries that had no launch capability 10 years ago, all of this has compressed into a very short time frame an enormous expansion in the number of objects being put into orbit. And every object put into orbit has to come back down eventually. The question is never whether. The question is always where and when and in what condition. To understand the full scale of the problem, you need to understand what the numbers actually look like in July 2026. The number of tracked space debris objects rose by over 100% from 2013 to 2024, from 23,000 to over 47,000 tracked objects. And those are just the pieces large enough to be detected at all. NASA estimates that millions more small pieces of debris are orbiting Earth unnoticed. NASA estimates millions more. Small pieces of debris, paint flakes, metal fragments, pieces of insulation, that are too small to track individually but are moving fast enough to be catastrophically damaging if they strike an active satellite or spacecraft. Last year, more than 300 rockets attempted to reach orbit. 300 launch attempts in a single year. That is more than 5 times the average annual launch rate of the Cold War space race era, compressed into the single most active 12 months of human spaceflight history. Space junk can take a variety of forms, such as dead satellites, empty fuel tanks, or microscopic paint flecks. As space innovation and exploration has expanded in recent decades, researchers have been studying the motion of spacecraft to mitigate satellite collisions and possible hazards on Earth. Still, the debris has become an increasing issue. The increasing issue part of that sentence is the one that deserves the most attention. Because the concern is not just about individual incidents of debris landing on beaches or in rural villages, the concern goes much deeper to a mechanism that space engineers and physicists have been discussing since the 1970s, and that has only become more urgent as orbital traffic has expanded to its current unprecedented density. It is called the Kessler Syndrome. And if you have never heard of it, the concept is one of the most unsettling ideas in the entire field of orbital mechanics. Not because it is unlikely, but because it describes a threshold that, once crossed, is effectively irreversible on any human timescale. The Kessler Syndrome describes a potential chain reaction in Earth's orbit. When 2 satellites or larger pieces of debris collide, numerous new fragments are created, which in turn cause further collisions. At a certain point, the amount of space debris could continue to increase on its own, rendering individual orbits virtually unusable for decades or longer. The European Space Agency has recorded over 650 such fragmentation events in orbit since 1961. 650 confirmed events where one object in orbit collided with or exploded near another, generating new clouds of debris that are now themselves orbiting the Earth and creating new collision risks. The physics of what happens when 2 objects collide at orbital velocities is genuinely difficult to absorb intuitively. Some debris races through space at speeds of up to 29,000 kilometers per hour. That is almost 7 times faster than a rifle bullet. If such a piece of debris strikes an active satellite, a single collision can create hundreds of new pieces of debris, which in turn trigger further collisions, 7 times faster than a rifle bullet. At those velocities, a piece of debris the size of a marble carries the kinetic energy of a hand grenade. A piece the size of a golf ball has the energy of a small car traveling at highway speed. And these objects are invisible to the naked eye, traveling in 3-dimensional space around a curved planet, making avoidance maneuvers an ongoing operational requirement for every active satellite in certain orbital zones. Awareness of this entire issue of re-entry risk has increased significantly, says Marlon Sorge, who heads the Center for Orbital and Re-entry Debris Studies at the Aerospace Corporation. Many operators are deliberately designing their satellites so that nothing dangerous or very little that is dangerous remains. We must ensure that we implement guidelines and risk mitigation measures to prevent these objects from becoming a problem. Implementing guidelines and risk mitigation measures. That language points towards something important, the gap between the scale of the problem and the current state of international coordination to address it. The Outer Space Treaty of 1967 provides the basic legal framework for space activities, but it was written in an era when only 2 countries had meaningful launch capability, and annual launch rates were a fraction of today's numbers. It does not provide effective mechanisms for assigning liability when a piece of debris from an unidentified foreign rocket lands on your beach. It does not mandate debris mitigation standards that are binding on all launch actors globally. It does not resolve the question of who is responsible for a Kenya village when a metal ring falls on it from space. That regulatory gap is part of why the Australian Space Agency is still, as of this week, working with international authorities to determine whose rocket produced the 6 spheres at Forest Beach. The investigation involves analyzing the metallurgy and engineering specifications of the objects, comparing them against known rocket designs and materials used by different space agencies, and potentially examining the re-entry trajectory to narrow down which launch vehicle could have produced this debris at this location. It is detective work conducted at the intersection of orbital mechanics and international relations, and it can take months to reach a definitive conclusion. The sphere story, and the broader space debris story it exemplifies, also connects to a history of mysterious metallic objects that have been appearing around the world for longer than most people realize. Last year, a very similar sphere made headlines in Bouguer, Colombia, reportedly without any visible welds and featuring strange symbols on its surface. To this day, it remains unclear whether that sphere is actually space debris or simply an elaborate prank. And going back much further, in the midst of World War II, the New York Times reported in December 1944 on shiny silver spheres that American pilots claimed to have observed over German territory. At the time, they were thought to be a new German secret weapon. Even the American Department of Defense officially confirmed a few years ago that small spherical objects in particular make up a large part of all reported sightings of unidentified aerial phenomena. So, spheres seem to have been fueling collective imagination for decades, whether in the sky over wartime Europe or quite concretely on a beach in Queensland. But the reality of what these specific objects are is far more interesting and far more consequential than any supernatural explanation, because it forces a confrontation with something that is happening in the real world right now and will only intensify over the coming years. While no documented deaths have occurred due to space debris, there have been reports of injuries, noted John Chrysaitis, professor of mechanical and aerospace engineering at New York's University at Buffalo. A 6-year-old boy in China's Shanxi province was hit by a rocket fragment in 2002. A few years prior, Lottie Williams was struck by a piece of space debris in a suburb of Tulsa County, Oklahoma, becoming the first person known to have been struck by falling space debris. The first verified case ever of a person being struck by space debris. She survived, the object was small, and had slowed significantly through the atmosphere. But the fact that a documented case exists at all, that there is a first verified human casualty of the space debris problem, even a minor one, illustrates in the most personal possible terms that this is not a purely technical or academic concern. A 2022 statistical study warned that the expanding volume of orbital traffic is steadily increasing the mathematical probability of falling space debris causing casualties on the ground. Steadily increasing probability, not static, not declining, increasing. Because as the number of objects in orbit grows and as launch rates continue to expand, the number of re-entry events grows proportionally. The majority of those re-entries result in objects burning up completely in the atmosphere. The physics of re-entry is genuinely brutal for most materials, but the subset of objects that are specifically engineered to withstand extreme conditions, like the pressure vessels that landed at Forest Beach, are also the subset most likely to survive all the way to the surface. The industry response to this challenge is real, even if it remains inadequate relative to the scale of the problem. SpaceX has built reusability into its core rocket architecture. Boosters that land back at the launch site for refurbishment and reuse rather than falling into the ocean. Other companies are developing small robotic arms and capture mechanisms designed to actively retrieve dead satellites from orbit and either deorbit them in controlled fashion or move them to less congested orbital zones. The European Space Agency has been funding research into active debris removal technologies since well before the Forest Beach incident made headlines. None of this solves the problem in the near term, but awareness is growing, and the investment in solutions is growing alongside it. According to NASA, space debris is any human-made object, such as a piece of spacecraft that orbits the Earth and no longer has a functioning purpose. The Australian Space Agency noted that while most debris lands in a specific place on Earth, other objects' falls may be more difficult to predict. More difficult to predict. That phrase contains the fundamental operational challenge in its entirety. Re-entry prediction, even with the most sophisticated atmospheric models and orbital tracking systems currently available, carries significant uncertainty. Small variations in atmospheric density, which fluctuates with solar activity, with Earth's rotation, with seasonal changes, create cascading uncertainties in exactly where and when a re-entering object will reach the ground. For a large, dense object like a pressure vessel, that uncertainty window can span thousands of kilometers of ground track, which is why 6 metal spheres can end up on a beach in Queensland rather than in the ocean 300 kilometers to the east. And nobody can tell you with certainty in advance that this specific beach in this specific coastal town is where they are going to land. Australia is especially likely to see falling space junk because of its massive land area. Remote areas make it more likely that debris can fall without immediately injuring people. But experts warn the broader trend is moving in the wrong direction. Moving in the wrong direction. More launches, more hardware in orbit, more re-entries, more probability of debris reaching populated areas. The trajectory is clear, and the mechanisms driving it are not slowing down. The commercial space industry is in an expansion phase with no near-term ceiling in sight. National space programs from countries that had limited launch capability 5 years ago are now regular participants in the orbital environment. The satellite constellation programs, thousands of small satellites deployed to provide global internet coverage, add objects to orbit at a rate that was simply inconceivable when the existing regulatory frameworks were designed. There is one more dimension to the Kessler Syndrome discussion that rarely gets mentioned in mainstream coverage and deserves to be stated plainly. The Kessler Syndrome is sometimes discussed as a potential explanation for the Fermi paradox. The question of why, given the enormous size and age of the universe and the billions of potentially habitable planets in it, we have not detected clear evidence of other technological civilizations. One version of the answer is that technological civilizations could eventually fill their own orbital environments with debris to such an extent that further space travel becomes extremely dangerous, trapping them on their home planets and cutting them off from the broader universe. The idea is that self-generated space junk could be a filter that technological species regularly fail to get through, producing a civilization capable of launching things into orbit, but then unable to maintain a safe orbital environment long enough to develop the next level of spacefaring capability. Whether or not that is the correct explanation for the Fermi paradox, it illustrates in the starkest possible terms why the space debris problem is not a side issue or a technical footnote to the expansion of the space industry. It is, potentially, one of the most consequential long-term challenges that any technological civilization faces. And right now, as of July 14, 2026, 6 metal spheres are sitting in an evidence facility in Queensland while international space agencies work to identify whose rocket launched them and when. The Queensland Fire Department reported that a 50-meter exclusion zone remains in place while scientific teams monitor the area. It is possible that more space debris could be found in the coming days. More debris could be found in the coming days. The investigation is still active. The re-entry event that produced these spheres also may have produced additional material that has not yet been located. Somewhere along the re-entry trajectory, there may be other pieces waiting to be found on another beach, in another field, in another coastal community that does not yet know it is about to discover something that has traveled from orbit. The Australian Space Agency's official advisory remains in effect and applies not just to Queensland, but to anyone anywhere who might encounter similar objects now or in the future. Do not touch. Do not move. Do not attempt to recover or examine suspected space debris. Assume it is hazardous until advised otherwise by the relevant authorities. Move away and contact emergency services. That advisory exists because the substances stored inside pressure vessels during a rocket launch or orbital operation are not benign. Hypergolic propellants, pressurized gases, cryogenic fluids. The contents of a pressure vessel from a space launch vehicle are chosen for their performance characteristics in a space environment, not for their safety profile when encountered unexpectedly by a member of the public on a beach. If you are ever in a situation where you come across something that looks like it does not belong, a metallic sphere in the sand, a charred fragment in a field, an unfamiliar object that is clearly manufactured but whose origin you cannot identify, the message from the Australian Space Agency, from NASA, from the European Space Agency, and from every space debris specialist working on this issue is unanimous. Walk away. Call the authorities. Let people with the right equipment and the right expertise handle what comes next. Because that metal ball sitting in the sand is not a piece of abstract orbital mechanics. It is not a theoretical risk scenario from a policy paper. It is 6 months of orbital decay, thousands of kilometers of re-entry trajectory, a fireball through the upper atmosphere, and then a splash in the water offshore from a Queensland beach, followed by the tide bringing it in to where someone out for a Saturday morning walk found it sitting in the sand, looking shiny and strange and completely out of place. The question of where it really came from, which country, which rocket, which launch, which mission, is still being worked out. But the broader question of what it represents is already answered. It represents the space above your head in July 2026, more crowded than it has ever been in human history. And every year, more of what goes up must come down.